Welcome, my friends, to a tale where love, redemption, and family collide unexpectedly. Secrets long buried resurface, hearts are tested, and lives are changed forever. Join me on this journey where the truth unravels, and new beginnings emerge from the shadows. You won't want to miss what happens next.
Michael Porter was pacing the floor of his lavish penthouse, the soft glow of the city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. At 55, Michael was a man who commanded respect in the world of finance, but at this moment he felt anything but in control. His glass of bourbon remained untouched on the bar as he anxiously glanced at the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m., and his 21-year-old daughter, Claire, was still not home. The sound of the elevator doors sliding open caught his attention. He turned just as Claire stumbled into the room, her dress slightly askew, her makeup smudged, and her eyes glassy from too much alcohol. "Where have you been?" Michael's voice was a low growl, barely masking his anger. "Out," Claire replied with a defiant shrug. "Does it really matter?" "It does when you're out all night, drinking and behaving like a spoiled brat," he snapped back. Claire's eyes flashed with a mix of hurt and anger. "Why do you even care? You've never cared about anything but your precious company." "Watch your mouth, young lady," Michael warned, his temper rising. "You're just like your mother, always looking for someone to blame for your own failures." "Don't you dare talk about her," Claire shouted, her voice breaking. "You pushed her away, just like you're pushing me away." Michael's jaw tightened as memories of his late wife, Lily, had flooded back. It had been nearly 10 years since she had died, leaving behind a hole in their lives that had never truly healed. But there was no room for weakness in Michael's world, and he had always seen Lily's gentleness as a flaw, something that had ultimately led to her untimely death. "You don't know what you're talking about," Michael said coldly. "She couldn't handle the pressure. I had no choice but to keep everything running smoothly." Claire's face crumpled with tears. She was kind and loving, everything you're not, and you crushed her spirit until there was nothing left. Michael's heart hardened against the pain in her voice. "Go to bed, Claire. You're making a fool of yourself." But Claire didn't move. "I'm leaving," she declared, her voice firm despite the tears. "I don't need you or this life anymore." Michael watched as she stormed out of the room, leaving him alone with his anger and regret. He sank into the nearest chair, rubbing his temples as he tried to push away the painful memories. Claire was young and impulsive. She would come back, he told himself. She always did. Meanwhile, Claire was speeding down a dark, empty road in her sleek black sports car, her mind racing faster than the car itself. She needed to get away, to escape the suffocating life her father had created for her. A life of luxury and privilege, but devoid of warmth or love. Her mother had been the only light in her life, and with her gone, Claire felt more lost than ever. Tears blurred her vision as she replayed the argument with her father in her head. How could he speak about her mother like that? How could he be so cold, so unfeeling? The man who had once been her hero had turned into someone she could barely recognize. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. Claire gasped and slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car struck the man with a sickening thud, and he was thrown onto the pavement. Heart pounding, Claire jumped out of the car and ran to his side. "Oh my God! Are you okay?" she cried, kneeling beside him. "Please say something." The man groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He was young, not much older than Claire, with tousled dark hair and deep brown eyes. His clothes were torn and dirty, and he was bleeding from a cut on his forehead. "I'm so sorry," Claire babbled, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. "I'll call an ambulance." "No," the man said, his voice weak but firm. "No hospital." "But you're hurt," Claire protested, looking at him with concern. "I'm fine," he insisted, trying to sit up but wincing in pain. "Just need to get home." "At least let me take you," Claire offered, feeling a pang of guilt. "It's the least I can do after what happened." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. Claire helped him to his feet, feeling a strange connection as his hand gripped hers. She guided him to the passenger seat and then retrieved his wallet that had fallen from his pocket. Inside, she found a driver's license with the name Daniel Reed and an address not far from where they were. "Let's get you home, Daniel," she said softly as she started the car. The drive was quiet. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Claire glanced over at Daniel, who was staring out the window, lost in thought. Despite the circumstances, she felt oddly comforted by his presence, as if she had known him for much longer than just a few minutes. They arrived at a small, rundown house on the edge of town. The paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown, but there was a certain charm to the place that Claire couldn't deny. Daniel directed her to pull into the driveway, and she helped him out of the car. "Thank you," he said quietly as they reached the front door. "Do you need anything else?" Claire asked, reluctant to leave him just yet. Daniel shook his head, but there was a softness in his eyes that made Claire's heart ache. "You've done enough. I'll be fine." "Are you sure?" she pressed, not ready to let go of the moment. He nodded again, and she sighed, stepping back reluctantly. "Okay, but if you need anything—" "I'll be okay," Daniel repeated, giving her a small, reassuring smile. Claire returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She turned and walked back to her car, pausing for a moment before getting in. She looked back at Daniel, who was still standing at the door, watching her with that same unreadable expression. "Take care, Daniel," she said softly, then drove away, the night swallowing her up once more. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she had left something important behind. As she drove back to the city, her mind kept returning to Daniel, the look in his eyes, the warmth of his hand in hers. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to him in a way she had never felt before. The next morning, Michael was already at the office when Claire stumbled into the kitchen, bleary-eyed and exhausted. She hadn't slept at all, her mind too busy replaying the events of the previous night. "Good morning," she muttered as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Morning," Michael replied, barely glancing up from his newspaper. Claire hesitated, then decided to test the waters. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something." Michael finally looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What is it?" She took a deep breath. "I met someone last night. I think I might go see him again." Michael's expression darkened. "Who is he?" "Just someone I ran into," Claire said evasively, not wanting to get into the details. "He's different, Dad. He's not like anyone I've met before." "Different how?" Michael asked suspiciously. "He's kind," Claire said, her voice softening as she thought of Daniel. "He doesn't care about money or status. He's just real." Michael's frown deepened. "Claire, you need to be careful. People like that can't be trusted. They'll say whatever you want to hear to get what they want." Claire bristled at his words. "Not everyone is like you, Dad. Some people actually care about more than just money." Michael's eyes narrowed. "I'm only trying to protect you, Claire. You don't know what the world is really like." "Maybe I don't," she shot back, "but I'd rather find out for myself than live in your shadow." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Michael to stew in his own bitterness. The next few days passed in a blur for Claire. She found herself driving back to Daniel's house more often than she had planned, bringing him groceries, helping him clean up the yard, and just talking. She learned that Daniel had been living alone since his mother had passed away a year ago, leaving him the old house but little else. He worked odd jobs around town, just barely scraping by, but he never complained. Claire felt a growing connection to Daniel, one that both thrilled and scared her. He was everything she had been searching for, kind, compassionate, and unafraid to be himself. And he didn't judge her for her past or her family, something that made her feel more at ease with him than she had with anyone else. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Claire turned to Daniel with a question that had been gnawing at her for days. "Daniel, why didn't you want to go to the hospital that night?" He was silent for a long moment, staring at the horizon. "I've had enough of hospitals," he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. "My mom spent the last few months of her life in one. I don't ever want to go back." Claire's heart twisted with sympathy. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "It's okay," he said softly, squeezing back. "You couldn't have known." They sat in silence for a while, their hands still entwined. The connection between them was undeniable, and Claire found herself wanting to explore it further, to see where it might lead. "Daniel," she said hesitantly, "I know this might sound crazy, but what if we tried something different?" He looked at her curiously. "Different how?" She bit her lip, trying to find the right words. "I mean, what if we tried to make something more of this? Of us?" Daniel's eyes widened in surprise, but then a slow smile spread across his face. You mean, like a relationship? Claire nodded, feeling her cheeks flush with embarrassment. I know it's sudden, but I feel like we have something special here, something worth exploring. Daniel's smile grew wider, and he leaned in closer, his voice low and tender. Claire, I've felt the same way since the moment I met you. I just didn't know how to say it. Claire's heart skipped a beat, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. So, does that mean you're interested? Very, Daniel replied, his eyes twinkling with affection. They shared a long, lingering kiss, one that seemed to seal the deal. For the first time in a long time, Claire felt truly happy, like she had finally found where she belonged. But life had a way of throwing curveballs, and it wasn't long before their newfound happiness was tested. One afternoon, as Claire and Daniel were working together to clear some brush from the yard, a sleek black car pulled up to the house. Claire froze as she recognized the car. It was her father's. Daniel glanced at her, concern etched on his face. Is that? Yes, Claire whispered, dread curling in her stomach. Michael stepped out of the car, his expression thunderous as he strode toward them. So this is where you've been hiding, Michael said, his voice cold and accusing. Claire took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. I'm not hiding, Dad. I'm living my life. Living your life with this nobody? Michael sneered, glaring at Daniel with disdain. You're throwing everything away for him? I'm not throwing anything away, Claire shot back, her temper flaring. I'm finally doing something for myself, something that makes me happy. Happy? Michael scoffed. You think this is going to make you happy? Living in a shack with a man who has nothing to offer you? He has plenty to offer, Claire retorted. He's kind, he's caring, and he's real, something you'll never understand. Michael's face darkened with anger. You're making a mistake, Claire. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. I know exactly what I'm doing, Claire said firmly, and I'm not going to let you control my life anymore. Michael's eyes narrowed and he turned his attention to Daniel. How much? He asked bluntly. Daniel frowned in confusion. What? How much money will it take for you to walk away from my daughter? Michael demanded, his voice dripping with contempt. Name your price. Daniel stared at him in shock, his hands balling into fists at his sides. I don't want your money, he said through gritted teeth. Everyone has a price, Michael said dismissively. Just tell me what it is, and I'll make sure you never have to work another day in your life. Claire stepped in front of Daniel, her eyes blazing with fury. How dare you? He's not for sale, Dad, and neither am I. Watch your tone, young lady, Michael snapped. I've given you everything you've ever wanted, and this is how you repay me? By throwing your life away for some lowlife? I'm not throwing my life away, Claire repeated, her voice trembling with emotion. I'm choosing a different path, one that doesn't involve you or your money. Michael's face twisted with rage, but before he could respond, Daniel spoke up. Claire, he said quietly, it's okay. I understand if this is too much for you. If you want to leave, I won't hold it against you. Claire turned to him, her heart breaking at the sadness in his eyes. Daniel, no. I don't want to leave. I want to be with you. But what about your father? Daniel asked, his voice filled with concern. He's not my concern anymore, Claire said firmly. You are. Daniel looked at her with a mix of love and sadness, then turned back to Michael, his jaw set with determination. You can keep your money, Daniel said, his voice steady. I don't want it, and I don't want anything from you. The only thing I care about is Claire. Michael stared at him in disbelief, his face growing redder by the second. You're a fool, he spat. You'll never be able to give her the life she deserves. Maybe not, Daniel said quietly, but I'll give her the life she wants. With that, Daniel turned to Claire and took her hand, leading her away from her father. Michael stood there, stunned, as they walked back toward the house, their hands intertwined. Inside, Claire felt a rush of relief as they closed the door behind them, shutting out the anger and bitterness that had been a constant presence in her life. I'm so sorry, Claire whispered, leaning her head against Daniel's chest. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It's not your fault, Daniel said softly, wrapping his arms around her. Your father, he's just trying to protect you, in his own way. But he doesn't understand that you're not a little girl anymore. Claire sighed, closing her eyes as she listened to the steady beat of Daniel's heart. I just want to be with you, she murmured. I don't care about the rest, and I want to be with you. Daniel replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. We'll figure this out together. They stood there in silence for a while, simply holding each other, finding comfort in their shared warmth. But the encounter with Michael had left a shadow over their happiness. And Claire couldn't shake the feeling that more trouble was on the horizon. The next few weeks were a blur of emotions. Claire tried to focus on building a life with Daniel, helping him with the house, and learning more about the simple joys of living without the trappings of wealth. But the tension with her father lingered, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he made another move. That move came one crisp autumn morning when Claire received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from a law firm, informing her that she had been disinherited from her father's estate. All her accounts had been frozen, and she was no longer welcome at the Porter family properties. Claire read the letter in stunned silence, her heart pounding in her chest. She had known her father would be angry, but she hadn't expected him to go this far. "What is it?" Daniel asked, noticing her pale face. Claire handed him the letter, unable to speak. Daniel read it quickly, his expression darkening with each word. "He's disowned you," Daniel said quietly, looking up at her with concern. "He's really cut you off." Claire nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I knew he'd be mad, but I didn't think he'd actually do it." Daniel reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll be okay," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "We'll get through this together." Claire looked into his eyes, finding comfort in the warmth and strength she saw there. "I don't care about the money," she said, her voice trembling. "I just want to be with you." Daniel smiled softly, pulling her into a tight embrace. "And I want to be with you. We'll figure this out, one step at a time." But despite their resolve, the reality of their situation began to weigh heavily on them. With her accounts frozen and no access to her trust fund, Claire was forced to live on the meager savings she had left. The life of luxury she had once known was now a distant memory, replaced by the harsh reality of living paycheck to paycheck. Still, Claire refused to give up. She took on odd jobs around town, just as Daniel had, and they both worked tirelessly to make ends meet. Their love grew stronger with each passing day, and they found solace in each other's company, even as the world around them seemed to crumble. But the strain was undeniable, and there were nights when Claire would lie awake, wondering if they had made the right choice. She missed the comforts of her old life, the security that came with knowing she would never have to worry about money. But then she would think of Daniel, of the way he made her feel, and she knew that she had made the right decision. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Daniel turned to Claire with a serious expression. "Claire, there's something I need to tell you," he said quietly, his voice tinged with hesitation. "What is it?" Claire asked, sensing the tension in his voice. Daniel took a deep breath, then looked into her eyes. "There's something about my past that I haven't told you. Something I think you need to know." Claire's heart skipped a beat, fear creeping into her chest. "What is it, Daniel? What's wrong?" Daniel hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "I'm not who you think I am. I mean, I am, but there's more to my story." Claire frowned, confusion clouding her mind. "What do you mean?" Daniel took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "My real name isn't Daniel Reed. It's Daniel Lawson. My father, he was a wealthy businessman, just like your dad, but he abandoned my mom when I was just a baby. We lived in poverty while he lived a life of luxury." Claire stared at him in shock, trying to process what he was saying. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Daniel looked down, guilt written all over his face. "I didn't want you to think I was like him. I didn't want you to think I was using you to get back at your father." Claire felt a pang of sympathy for him, her heart aching for the pain he had carried all these years. "Daniel, I don't care about your past. I care about you, and I know you're nothing like him." Daniel looked up at her, his eyes filled with emotion. "I didn't want to keep this from you, but I was scared that you would see me differently, that you would think I was just like your father." Claire shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't think that at all. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Daniel. And I'm not going to let your past change that." Daniel let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Claire. I don't deserve you." Claire smiled through her tears, pulling him into a tight embrace. "We're in this together, Daniel, no matter what." They held each other for a long time, finding comfort in their shared strength and love. The revelation of Daniel's past had only brought them closer, and they knew that they could face anything as long as they were together. But their peace was short-lived. A few days later, Claire received a phone call that would change everything. It was from a lawyer representing her father's estate. Michael Porter had been in a car accident, and he was in critical condition at the hospital. The lawyer informed Claire that her father had left instructions in his will that she be notified in case of any emergency. Claire's heart sank as she listened to the news, her mind reeling with a mix of emotions. Despite everything that had happened between them, he was still her father. And now, he was on the brink of death. "I have to go," Claire said, her voice shaking as she hung up the phone. Daniel looked at her with concern. "What happened?" "My dad, he's in the hospital. They don't know if he's going to make it," Claire said, tears streaming down her face. Daniel's expression softened, and he pulled her into a comforting embrace. "Do you want me to come with you?" Claire nodded, grateful for his support. "Yes, please. I don't think I can do this alone." They drove to the hospital in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. When they arrived, they were directed to the ICU, where Michael was being kept under close observation. Claire's heart clenched as she saw her father lying in the hospital bed, hooked up to various machines. He looked so small, so fragile, a far cry from the imposing figure she had always known. The doctor approached them, his expression grave. "Are you Claire Porter?" he asked gently. "Yes," Claire replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid your father's condition is very serious," the doctor said kindly. "He sustained severe injuries in the accident, and it's unclear if he will recover." Claire felt a wave of grief wash over her, her knees buckling under the weight of the news. Daniel caught her before she could fall, holding her close as she sobbed into his chest. "I'm so sorry, Claire," the doctor said, his voice filled with compassion. "We're doing everything we can, but you should prepare yourself for the worst." Claire nodded numbly, unable to speak. She felt as if her entire world was crashing down around her, the anger and resentment she had held toward her father evaporating in the face of his mortality. For the next few days, Claire stayed by her father's side, Daniel never leaving her for a moment. They barely spoke, the silence between them filled with unspoken fears and regrets. On the third day, the doctors told Claire that Michael's condition had worsened and that he didn't have much time left. They advised her to say her goodbyes. Claire felt her heart shatter as she sat by her father's bedside, taking his hand in hers. He was unconscious, but she hoped that somehow he could hear her. "Dad," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry for everything. I wish we could have made things right before it was too late." She paused, her voice choked with emotion. "I know you tried to protect me in your way, but I needed more than that. I needed you to love me, to be there for me." Claire squeezed his hand, her tears falling onto the bedspread. "I love you, Dad. I always have, even when I was angry with you, and I forgive you. I hope you can forgive me too." As she spoke, she felt a slight squeeze of her hand and her heart skipped a beat. She looked up to see her father's eyes open, just a crack. "Claire," he whispered, his voice weak and raspy. "Dad," she gasped, her heart racing. "You're awake." Michael looked at her with pain and regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry. Claire, I was wrong." Claire shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Dad, it's okay. We'll make it through this. We can start over." But Michael shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. "I'm not going to make it, sweetheart, but I'm glad I got to see you one last time." Claire sobbed, leaning over to hug him gently. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too," Michael whispered, his voice growing weaker. "Take care of yourself and be happy." Those were his last words before he slipped back into unconsciousness. And a few hours later, he passed away peacefully, with Claire holding his hand until the very end. In the days and weeks that followed, Claire struggled to come to terms with her father's death. But with Daniel by her side, she found the strength to keep going, to rebuild her life, and find happiness in the simple things. Michael's passing had left a void in her heart, but it had also given her a new perspective on life. She realized that love, kindness, and forgiveness were more important than anything else, and she vowed to live her life with those values at the forefront. Claire and Daniel eventually married in a small, intimate ceremony, surrounded by the friends they had made in their new life. And though her father wasn't there to walk her down the aisle, she felt his presence with her, guiding her toward a future filled with hope and love. As they stood together, hand in hand, Claire looked into Daniel's eyes and knew that they had found something truly special. They had faced the worst together and came out stronger for it, their love growing deeper with each passing day. At that moment, Claire knew that she had finally found what she had been searching for all along, a life filled with love, happiness, and the unbreakable bonds of family.